and join us now as the panelists get settled. My name is Ariel Tsaekwi Deranger, and I'm the Executive Director of Indigenous Climate Action. So, ho'a, welcome, and Masicho, thank you for coming. Tonight's panel is called Invest in Indigenous Sovereignty, and our host today and our moderator will be the wonderful Jayce Chiblow. And we'll also be joined by Clayton Thomas-Müller, Larissa Baldwin-Roberts, and Melina Laboucan-Massimo. And with that, I'm going to pass it to Jayce Chiblow. Again, thank you so much for joining us.
Well, she took my intro. It's okay. Just a leader, naturally. Welcome, everyone. Minande Beneshi Kwe Indigenous Gitsagansi Bean Donjaba, Gigo Ndodam, Anishinaabe Kwe, and Port Moody Megwandinda. So hello, my name is Jayce Chiblow. I work with Indigenous Climate Action as the Director of Education and Programming, and I'm very honored to be here with these amazing panelists. Before we even get started, I'm just going to pass it right over to you, Clayton, to do our opening.
Can you hear me? Hey, I'm just being a joker. Okay. Well, I always like to carry an eagle feather in these types of events so that you know I'm not bullshitting you. My Nietzsche's know what I'm talking about. Yeah, okay. Well, bonjour, tanse. Zonge benesi enene tishnakas kinutotem. Winnipeg and Dojib, Puggawagan Cree Nation in Dojib. And you might be like, why is a Cree guy talking in Ojibwe? It's because I grew up in the city of Winnipeg, Manitoba, Canada, which is kind of Ojibwe territory. So all the ceremonies I had access growing up were Medewan ceremonies, Ojibwe ceremonies. So I learned to pray and sing in Ojibwe, but I'm actually Cree from Northern Canada, from Matthias Cologne Cree Nation, which is the furthest eastern Treaty 6 nation in our Treaty 6 territory, which spans all the way from where Ariel come from, over in Alberta, all the way to central Canada, to the Hudson Bay, where I come from. That's Treaty 6. And yeah, we just want to open up in a good way with a song and some quick words, just to bring in our ancestors into this space, to acknowledge those ancestors of this territory, of which we're all guests here in. And just to say, as a guest, I'm here to walk lightly and with respect. So, yeah. Mother Earth, Father Sky, star beings beyond Father Sky, the great mystery of the universe. I ask you to come here into this space in a good way and bless each and every single one of us, so that as we put our hearts, our minds, our spirits together, do something positive for our kids, that we take into mind Indigenous divestment strategies and the tactical framework that you guide us on, that you bless us on, that you protect us as we initiate. So help us with that in a good way. And we ask for the permission of those ancestors, the Vietnam. got us back home safely to our families, and we're all done building the biggest movement ever in the history of our species. So yeah, bless us in a good way, ancestors. Shimandu, Notawe, asking for this help. Ho!
All right. Miigwech, interesting to hear you're from Anishinaabe territory because we sing that same song back home in the ceremony. I love the connections. So welcome everyone to Invest in Indigenous Sovereignty, a panel discussion with Indigenous Climate Action and Sacred Earth Solar. So ICA is an Indigenous-led organization guided by a diverse group of Indigenous knowledge keepers, water protectors, and land defenders from communities and regions across so-called Canada. We believe that Indigenous people's rights and knowledge systems are critical to developing the solutions to the climate crisis and achieving climate justice. We're also co-hosting with Sacred Earth Solar, an Indigenous women-led grassroots organization that brings climate solutions and healing initiatives directly to the front lines of land protection, cultural resurgence, and language revitalization. Their work is led by Indigenous women, Two-Spirit, and gender-diverse teams, and they aim to reflect their lived experiences in all that they do. Their work is in solidarity with Indigenous communities and organizations who are protecting their homelands, their culture, and those who have been impacted the most by extractive industries, land dispossession, and climate change. We all believe that the time has come to reintegrate the wisdom of our ancestors by implementing a just transition. We work towards a future where we are no longer reliant on fossil fuels, reduce our greenhouse gas emissions, and inspire the world to join us all in creating a healthy planet for all generations to come. So today, we're going to explore how divestment can shift power back to Indigenous communities, strengthen Indigenous economies, and push for systemic change that prioritizes land protection, environmental justice, and true accountability from financial institutions. So broadly, divestment campaigns seek to block or interrupt financial investment in an industry or an institution as a means of stopping harmful activity and highlights the injustice caused by capitalistic economic activity. In the last 2 decades, folks like these have been leading divestment strategies increased by social movements to combat the climate crisis. They've worked to interrupt fossil fuel development and to destabilize public trust of the fossil fuel industry. And you can read more in our upcoming report that's going to be released, the Healing the Land report from Indigenous Climate Action. You can see that coming out next week. So just really briefly, an Indigenous rights-based fossil fuel, so long word, Indigenous rights-based fossil fuel divestment framework is different from mainstream climate movement frameworks because instead of narrowing our focus on climate emissions and climate impacts, we leverage the power and the rights of Indigenous peoples and our responsibilities to protect the land as instructed by our Indigenous legal orders. We push corporations to divest from the fossil fuel industry. This framework positions Indigenous sovereignty, title, and opposition as a financial risk in a way that banks and other financial institutions understand and can write down on their balance sheets. An Indigenous rights-based fossil fuel divestment strategy recognizes our rights and title for what they are, powerful tools for transforming the economy from extraction to regeneration and from life-threatening to life-affirming. So I encourage you to take a look for that report coming out next week. And with that, I wanted to allow the panelists to introduce themselves, just real quick in your language, however you like to introduce yourself, and I'll start with you, Melina.
Tanse guakia neo Melina Laboucan Laboucan-Massimo ni nihiao kineskum tanawao. I am Nihiao Laboucan-Massimo. I was born in my community of Little Buffalo, which is in Treaty 8 territory in the heart of the tar sands, and also logging, fracking, oil and gas, extractivism. So my community's been impacted since before I was born, and so I've been working on that. And I come here as a organizer for the past 20 years, working with Indigenous communities, including my own, and then also help co-found ICA and help found Sacred Earth Solar, which is one of the hosts today, and some other things that I won't go into too much, but it's really nice to be here and see everybody's faces in person. Tar Sands campaigner for a very long time. I mean, she said really quick and in your language, so I'm like not going into like the thing, but you know, I'll talk more in the, Hi.
Jingiwala, everyone. My name is Larissa Baldwin-Roberts. I'm a Widjabul Waiba woman. I grew up in northern New South Wales, on the east coast of Australia. Our country is hinterland and rainforests, and I have slow down, sorry. Have for a long time worked on, I come from a family of land rights activists, and for a long time we have been fighting for Indigenous rights in so-called Australia. A lot of the work that I've done over many years is around removing the social license for, I guess, the colonial state of Australia, and looking at how we do truth-telling, but within that, how we push back. And I think there's a lot of conversation that we can have here today around, mining proliferation in our communities, and how that is sold as a false solution is a really significant thing that we have to overcome. I also want to acknowledge my sister, fellow Bunjalung woman, Millie Telford, and we started the Seed Indigenous Youth Climate Network over a decade ago, and met so many people, whether all this mob, and we talked about Pacific Climate Warriors, and we were just talking about Kureti, our sister before, but just learning from so many Indigenous activists across the globe around how we take on this system and the industrial NGO complex that is just colonizing our spaces as well.
I just love how that word gets around. I mentioned my name's Strong Thunderbird Man in my language, and I'm Eagle Clan member, and I'm Cree from a community called Pugatawagan, but it also goes by the name of Matthias Colum Cree Nation. That was our treaty signatory when they made a deal with the Crown of Canada to share the landed resources back in the day. I'm a recovering elite global campaigner. I've been scrapping with multinational corporations on behalf of our people and the governments that we're working inclusion with for a number of decades. And I had to take a big step back from the movement just because my mental health, and I just finished my 7th career burnout, I think, and so I became an author. I wrote a book, did really well, and I've been, just starting to dip my toe back in the climate and Indigenous rights, social movement spaces again, and I thought that this Indigenous divestment issue was something that deserved some time, and I happened through my experience to have some things to share about the history of Indigenous divestment work. We'll get into that on the panel today. Oh, and I'm just really honored to be on the panel with these incredible leaders, and it's always just a real treat to get to do stuff with Indigenous climate action and Sacred Earth Solar.
Much. Thank you all. It's so lovely to have you here, and I'm so excited to be able to ask you some questions. I got a little excited. I need to slow down. I got that note. When I get excited, I get passionate. It's hard. So I'm going to start with you, Melina. You were one of the key folks that we actually interviewed for the Healing the Land report. You offered so many amazing insights on Indigenous-led movement strategies and stories of success. Specifically, the one I wanted to highlight is Melina hosted over 100 tours for major investors, international journalists, and high-profile celebrities to build awareness about what the tar sands truly is, especially for the impacts on the community. So can you tell us about how you brought awareness to the seriousness of the impacts of the tar sands development and work to push the companies to divest from their holdings?
Well, it was a very, very long, multi-year, pronged approach where we actually focused internationally. We went to Europe many times to talk to investors, to ask them to divest, confront CEOs and the chair and the board of corporations to divest, like Shell, Statoil, BP, Royal Bank of Scotland, Royal Bank of Canada. We talked to international pension funds, like the Norwegian pension fund at the time, and asked them to divest. And we did it internationally because nationally at the time, when we were in so-called Canada, we had a very far-right government. And with that Harper regime, they didn't want to talk about climate, they didn't want to talk about Indigenous rights, they didn't want to talk about environmental injustices or environmental racism. So we had to basically bring it outside of the country to shine a light on and put pressure in the country, which we did federally. And then things like the KXL pipeline, we started working with Indigenous communities, other impacted Indigenous communities. We're at ground zero in the tar sands, and there's many of us that are impacted by the tar sands. And have been for decades, and I still, and myself and Ariel, my sister over there, have really intense health issues now from it. Being exposed so many times to toxic chemicals, and family members that have cancer, and people I know that have cancer and have died from cancer and other health-related respiratory issues. So it's, it's very much a lived experience in the body, and it's very traumatic, to be quite honest, to always talk about it. So actually, like Clayton, I had to stop talking about it for a while because I was just triggering trauma. But we did this for about 15 years and just talked about our trauma every day to whoever would listen. And a lot of people actually did. I was actually quite surprised. I think I was doing 2 to 3, and I know it was my brothers and sisters also were 2 to 3 events a week, in different countries across the world, across Canada, across North America. And we just talked until we're blue in the face, trying to raise awareness about the tar sands, because at the time, tar sands wasn't actually used. People back home, people just called it the rigs. People were and so when we started working on this, people said, "What do you work on?" I was like, "I work on the tar sands issue." And they're like, "Tar sands and Jane, like the movie? What's tar sands?" And so people actually didn't know the word tar sands. This was, 2007, 2008. So we kind of made it a national issue, an international issue, but locally we also really wanted to ensure that we're uplifting the voices of our own community members, of our own families, of all the communities that we work in solidarity with. And so we started doing a healing walk where we started walking in ceremony with the elders, leading us through a really toxic zone, which was, I know, really hard on a lot of people's bodies, but people actually live there. And so we did a 13-kilometer walk in prayer and stopped traffic in the tar sands. And also did a lot of, I worked at Greenpeace at the time, and so I did also a lot of kind of arrestable situations for many years, where we were shutting down mines, shutting down, raising the red flag around the issue of climate, because at the time, again, in Canada, with the Harper regime, this is before Trudeau, they did not admit that the climate crisis even existed. They basically gaslit us for speaking about the climate crisis, and talking about just our own issues of not being able to breathe. And so my family had a massive oil spill, and people couldn't breathe. They had to shut down the school. These are the daily lived experiences that we would tell investors. And so we'd bring investors from Europe, from other parts of the world, and say, this is what you're actually investing in. You can, because we'd go to the CEO and we'd look at the portfolios that, sitting through these AGMs, these 5-hour AGMs in the Netherlands or whatever country we're in, and you'd see these really glossy portfolios of social responsibility, is what they called it at the time. And there was nothing about the financial risks of communities literally blockading and shutting down tar sands. There wasn't any discussion around the financial risks. So we started bringing financial risks into play. FPIC, also because the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples in 2007, was finally passed. So there was countries that were signing on to this, and so the United Nations Declaration. Oh, sorry, free, prior, and informed consent. And so we started utilizing that as a tool. And so one, it was to raise awareness that internationally our human rights were being violated in the tar sands. So raising awareness, raising the flag of financial risk. What else did we do? Yeah, UN DRIP, and then community connections with pipelines was a big thing that we started to do, because we were at ground zero in the tar sands. And for folks that maybe don't know as much in the tar sands, it's one of the biggest industrial projects on the face of the planet, or it is the biggest industrial project on the face of the planet, but people actually don't know that. And so when you come home to where we're from, the impact's everywhere. Anywhere you go, you cannot get away from it. And so we wanted to show that to people, but then also there's these tentacles that just spread out all across Turtle Island. And am I going too fast? Always. Okay. So there's pipelines, as everybody knows, pipelines nowadays, but we helped to stop with many communities working on the Enbridge Northern Gateway pipeline. We shut that down. The KXL pipeline shut down multiple times. I myself testified before U.S. Congress regarding the KXL pipeline, shut down the Energy East pipeline, and a lot of us worked really hard with the Trans Mountain pipeline. That one was, I'd say, for me, the kind of the dagger in the heart situation, driving from the West Coast all the way back to the tar sands, where there's just this massive pipeline that we couldn't shut down. And the company, we got it to the place where the company couldn't financially make it viable anymore, because where there was so much negative and blockades, people getting arrested. And the company sold it to the government, and the government picked up the tab and used taxpayer money, the Canadian government. So that's the only reason why we didn't shut that motherfucker down. And and so yeah, touring investors was a big part of the divestment because we wanted to show investors that these glossy things that you read about your company's investments isn't actually what's happening on the ground. And I feel like that was probably one of the more effective ways to actually show, because many investors at the time would pull me aside in these tours where I'd tour them for the week, show them the tar sands, talk with community elders, and they pull me aside. This would never happen in Sweden or wherever country they were from at the time. Like, this would never happen in our country, and they were shocked. And I think that was the biggest issue, to show the health issues that our communities were dealing with in the land and the environmental impact, the devastation to Mother Earth, the devastation to our four-legged ones, the devastation to every single life form that lives in our homelands is being impacted to this day. And so we worked for a long time to try to shut down the tar sands. And I think we were relatively successful, but it's, again, one of the biggest industrial projects on the planet. But we still work in different ways to do that. But yeah, I think I'll just stop there and pass it on. Hi.
Yes, please. I'm so grateful, one, to hear you speak about this, but also that you were so willing to throw your body on the line to protect the generations to come, and not just the generations to come, but the other people that aren't directly in the tar sands, but are still impacted by those things. So really grateful for your work and constantly trying to influence different kinds of frameworks and economic frameworks, which brings me to you, Clayton. Also a movement leader for a very long time, as you mentioned. We were just curious, in what ways have you seen Indigenous movement leaders like Melina, like Larissa, like yourself, influence economic frameworks and potentially make those kinds of shifts?
Yeah. I think that a lot of the work that Indigenous campaigners and our supporters have been able to do, like in kind of contemporary times, it's really just been, I think, about unveiling, mistruths and exposing people, colonizers, neo-colonizers, because, the formula hasn't changed, right? The recipe's the same. It's just that there are different actors, there are different, you know what I mean? Like, I always tell people it was like Native people back in the day. We had to deal with the church and the state, that unholy unity, and nowadays I argue that the new religion is capitalism instead of Christianity, and now we got to deal with these damn corporations, and they even gave them personhood, for crying out loud. So yeah, a lot of our work has been really about exposing or just telling truths, and it's so dramatic that really the emotional and visceral reaction to that by society has been quite dramatic, especially with the advent of social media and the embracement of storytelling through digital media technologies and social media. We've been able to significantly demonstrate, especially Standing Rock, as Indigenous peoples, that we don't need white intermediaries or the white corporate media to have our stories and our message picked up en masse by tens of millions of human beings across Mother Earth. We demonstrated that at Standing Rock. And we also demonstrated that we don't need the traditional, foundation, donor, nonprofit industrial complex to raise money to build our own Native, Indigenous controlled and owned infrastructure, especially when it comes to media and communications. We raised, $5 million to build the independent Indigenous media apparatus at Standing Rock, and we were destroying the corporate media companies as far as people tuning into Standing Rock, checking in on Facebook by the tens of millions. So we have a lot of power, we always have. Our ancestors are with us, and I think our leaders, like Indigenous women are pretty strong, and so we're in really good hands, I guess I would say, to really, I think, take advantage of this time. There's a lot of crisis right now. The world is a pretty overwhelming place, and I, for one, feel that it's a real loss of opportunity that we're not doing a big global climate march during this climate week, 40 days out from the US election. But there's war going on, and so I understand, people are scattered right now. But for us as Native people, I think in Canada, we have a tremendous opportunity. Divestment Well, we as Native people didn't create that strategy. I mean, there's a long history of divestment. We've seen that with South Africa. We see that right now with the boycott, divestment, sanctions campaign against the state of Israel. There's been a lot of uses of divestment as a strategy to pressure, people in power to make the right choice or to remove them from power and to put people in there who will do that, right? And so in Canada, we're in the era of what they call the era of truth and reconciliation. We just came out of a massive national commission called the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and there was a federal, like hundreds of millions of dollars spent on this process, where Canada came out of it with the Royal Commission or 94 recommendations that the country could respond to righten the historical wrongs in the relationship that the settler colonial state has with Native people, right? And so we're living in that era right now. And it's kind of like in the US, like when Bill Clinton made the environmental justice order, then there had to be an environmental justice scrutiny to every piece, every federal department, every legislation. It's got to have an EJ assessment to it, right? And it's kind of, we're kind of in a similar situation in Canada with the settler colonial state when it comes to the legacy of Indian residential schools and the ongoing hollowness that predominantly progressives are feeling whenever they hear a land acknowledgement or whenever they hear, oh, I'm sorry about genocide, but it doesn't come with here's your land back. A lot of people are starting to recognize, non-Native people, how hollow that is. And so the conversation is rich right now in opportunity for us, I think, to further sophisticate our strategies. I think Melina did a really good job in talking about the multi-pronged, sophisticated campaign, strategic and tactical framework that we've built over decades to build the world's largest and most visible intersectional climate justice and Indigenous rights campaign, which is the Indigenous Tar Sands campaign. And divestment and financial risk in particular that's tied to companies and countries doing business and developing in Indigenous lands without their consent on lands that are still in dispute within colonial courts, okay? And so, this time right now that we're in, we're dealing with a bunch of gangsters, The oil companies, back in my day when I first started in the movement, we referred to them as greenhouse gangsters, and they really are. And what did they do to get the gangsters? Because they couldn't arrest them, right? They had to follow the money, RICO. That's how they got Al Capone, and that's the same damn thing that we got to do to these oil companies and anybody who's invested in profiting off the climate crisis. Is we have to target the money and follow it. And in Canada, we have a very unique rights-based campaigning framework that we can use, I think, that will garner a lot of results and expand our political base of resistance, in really dramatic ways. And so, yeah, I'm really excited to be here because, the opportunity to meet with other Indigenous folks to talk about, what does Indigenous divestment mean? How do we own, and benefit from these campaigns that come out of this conversation of why we're convening here today? And, a big piece of that is having, banks, actually testing and embarrassing and exposing banks when they don't honor their commitments to ensure that their clients they're lending money to have required the free, prior, and informed consent of the populations impacted by the investment, right? This is the work that we're doing that's very specific to Indigenous rights framework. And it's a little bit different than just getting population to move their money out of banks. Like for Indigenous peoples, it would be strategic for institutional investors in banks that do big business in Indian country and that are dependent on Indians, like Walmart, for example. Who does Walmart bank with? Let's get them to get their bank out of, if their bank's invested in something that's harming Native people, we'll get them the heck out of there, get their money out of there. You know what I mean? There's lots of examples like that. And I think that's where I think the rest of the financial risk sector, that's looking at, climate calamities and different elements of the global climate crisis, insurance companies, we need to continue to, I think, develop this analysis about the risk associated to not honoring the treaties, to not, honoring land back and the intentions of that youth-led, woman-led social movement, there's a number of things that we can do, but it does require us to come together and talk. And I think that there's a lot of lessons, and I'll end with this. There's a lot of lessons that we can learn for those of us that are older that were a part of when Obama got elected. And when Obama was greening the economic stimulus to get the United States out of recession. All the EJ groups, all environmental justice groups, climate justice groups, and indigenous rights groups got together here in New York City, and we were going to talk about how could we leverage all of our strong points. And at the end of the day, we didn't work together, And it's unfortunate because indigenous peoples are earmarked, as you all know. There's some people from NCI here. They get transfer payments, to the tunes. They get infrastructure money. They're powerful, the tribal nations. It's the same thing in Canada. And, I guess my message is that we have to communicate. And if we're doing strategies following the money, a big piece for how we're going to get some powerful allies in the form of sovereign indigenous nations is through ensuring that this idea about reinvestment, that we kind of demystify that space and maybe like dehomogenize it, because it's a pretty white space, at least in the United States right now. The people that are talking about where do we reinvest the trillions of dollars we've taken out of the fossil fuel economy thus far in the global divestment movement, we need to link that conversation with where's that money going with, ideas like electrifying rural areas, not for gold mines, but, so rural people can have internet. We need to start having those conversations and linking the stuff that's happening in terms of climate justice and moving money in cities to be a little bit more reflective too of the rest of where people are living. And for indigenous peoples, that's on the res. That's in Canada. Most Canadians live within 50 kilometers of the US-Canada border, and the rest of Canada is populated by indigenous peoples, Inuit, Métis, and in the circumpolar regions, Inuit and Métis, and then of course 634 First Nations. So there's a lot of opportunities there to move a lot of money to do the right thing, until we get rid of money and live in a utopian Star Trek society, hopefully.
Very well put, as usual, and you actually brought forward a couple of, and I think it's really great that this is lining up. So in the report, we highlight quite a few calls to action, and one of the ones that you touched on, and also you, Melina, was mobilizing community action, so uniting for change. And advocating for just divestment, I think, is really important to highlight. So joining forces with other Indigenous communities, our international relatives as well, and allies to advocate for meaningful divestment from harmful industries. And then the secondary one that came up that you spoke to that reminded me was a systemic overhaul, so demanding an end to business as usual extractive industries and challenging the status quo of those industries and financial practices, and pushing for an entire system overhaul that prioritizes the rights of Indigenous peoples, the planetary health, and human rights. Of course, we need we need equitable economic practices and sustainability over profit-driven models. So that framework shift that you spoke to, I think, is really important. And again, why I'm highlighting the report is because it just really seems to line up with a lot of the things that y'all are saying. And speaking of Global Community International, I have a question for you, Larissa. As the global community starts to make pledges to divest and commit to divestment, sorry, we have ASL interpretation online, and I do speak very fast. Let me start over. As the global community makes pledges to divest, phase down and out, hopefully, of fossil fuels, what does investment in Indigenous-led solutions look like and mean for Indigenous peoples globally?
I first want to start with a little bit of context around Australia, and I think a lot of people don't understand so-called Australia and the idea that we actually have hundreds of Indigenous First Nations people. Our proximity to colonisation, there were communities and nations across Australia who didn't experience colonisation until the 70s. So this matters in terms of the doctrine of terra nullius, which is the idea that this was no man's land, how Australia was so-called founded. 30 years ago, the highest court in our land overturned the doctrine of terra nullius in Australia. So basically, left Australia up to through, I'm looking at Tish because she's a Torres Strait Islander woman, but because of the Torres Strait Islands and land challenges that happened there around this being our land, us never being removed from our land, and basically what it did is it overturned the doctrine that Australia was founded on. In terms of what happened over that, so we'd already had big campaigns for land rights through the 30s, 40s, 50s, and won significant land rights. But then what we acknowledged through the overturning of terra nullius is that native title rights existed, that 2 laws existed on this land. And the High Court went as far as saying that we're not going to answer the question of who this land belongs to. There was a massive panic 30 years ago within Australia because it said that it didn't belong to Australia, and then acknowledging that laws exist here. And so there's a very short time frame for significant laws to change in our country that people don't understand. And the reason I laughed before when you were talking about reconciliation, because a lot of the work of our elders that came on the back of that was to basically create a reconciliation movement, because there was panic right across governments and corporations around how they would continue to basically derive profit from our communities. And I think this is really important context to understand who we are, but also understand kind of the global movements around our role in kind of creating Indigenous organisations and how we push back on huge corporatisation and kind of the raping and pillaging of our land. When we started SEED, we wouldn't have been able to start SEED. We were just having a yarn before about the Pacific Climate Warriors if we didn't reach out to our relatives in the Pacific around how they built frontline communities, talking about the climate crisis, slowing down, but also talking about how we formalise our organisations, and within that, not tokenising Indigenous peoples as just being the face of the climate crisis, when we're here for a rights-based fight. We're here for the future of our communities. And a lot of the work that we did was reaching out to IEN, ICA at the time, understanding the tar sands fight and these big, incredible licensing deals that happened basically in the last, early 2000s. Australia was basically covering Australia in oil and gas, coal licenses, incredible infrastructure was happening, and how do we push back on that? So we lent into the global Indigenous movement, and we found a bunch of people that we knew about. We reached out to people on Facebook and we said, hi, like Melly and Larissa, and like they're these amazing, incredible, like polluting projects, and like how do we stop them? What can we learn? And one of the things I just take away is just like the generosity and reciprocity that comes from the Indigenous movement globally is like nothing. Like whether it comes to sharing funders, whether it comes to sharing science, understanding messaging, like it has always been an open book of please take what you need and use what you can. And just like the incredible solidarity, like it has been the lifeblood of the work that we've done. Since 2010, there has not been a gas field developed in Australia because of that campaigning, right? And we learnt. So much from the tar sands, but also so much from the pipeline fights that happen. How do we stop the money from going into these fights? How do we mobilise our communities? What is the messaging that we use? You know, turning, you know, climate action and climate change, and our communities don't understand these Western frameworks, but they understand protecting country. They understand their cultural roles and their roles of looking after country. So, you know, when we talk about protecting country, talk about people and culture, free, prior and informed consent, you know, what our elders were being asked to sign, people are like, hang on a minute, we can't sign these things because this is going to, for generations to come, destroy our community. So I've had incredible frontline fights in Australia that are holding back humongous projects. And just today there were 4. We were talking before that there were 4 coal mines approved in Australia. One of the things I also want to talk about, and I don't want to call out so-called Canada, but I do, is that colonisation is a playbook. And one of the things that we experience as First Nations people in Australia is that Canada is seen as like this kind of, but Indigenous rights God. Like they got all the things right for Indigenous people. And what we see is an import. Yeah, but there is an import basically, like, you know, we have seen over the last 20 years, basically the government take away our traditional structures and put in its place structures that look like government bureaucracies and are government bureaucracies and are filled with a bunch of people that are sellouts and are doing the wrong things by our communities and the wrong things by our traditional structures. But that is too because of what happened around the legislation in a result to be like, we need to have economic development. At the same time, they're actually taking away the agency of our communities and our ability to self-determine, changing laws. And this is at the bequest of the mining industry, the most, you know, the largest lobby group in Australia. They own our governments. And they need to deal with the fact that Indigenous rights exist in this country. And the Australian governments at every level will do nothing to stop the wind back of Indigenous rights. And so what we've learned as young people coming through is that we have to, whether it's the courts, in legislation, we have to change hearts and minds, but we also have to speak from our own stories and experiences and learn from Indigenous people, because there is a whole bunch of things that are trying to happen, and I know we need to talk about transition from fossil fuels and the phase out of fossil fuels, but if we don't change the legislation around that protects Indigenous rights and self-determination, then renewable energy is going to create the same structures. And so this is also a significant part of the fight. So I think that there is so much to learn within that space, but also we have so far to go. And I think we need to build global Indigenous movements, right? Because the global mining movements they're a movement, they're gangsters, they're all together on this, the governments are together on this. You know, the idea that we have all these Aboriginal peak bodies literally comes from Canada. The idea that we've had wind back of basically how we can make investment in our communities, it can only come through government funding. That's because of what's come through Canada. It is not what we want to see across our communities. And so we need to talk about actually land back and land rights as the solution and not be afraid to talk about those things. But the fact that that is a global movement, actually, as Indigenous nations by ourselves, we cannot get the cut through. But I think when we speak kind of with that one voice and understanding and a shared experience, but not the same experience, actually we do get cut through on an international scale.
I agree totally. We need to continue to build the international movement spaces for our peoples. It's basically where I drew my inspiration from as a young person starting this work. I wanted to add really quickly too onto your point around basically one of the things that we're seeing now in so-called Canada, because we were able to get investors from banks, companies, and pension funds to divest from the tar sands. Now they're asking our communities to invest into those companies, and so they're trying to, not through impact benefit agreements, which is what they utilize through free prior informed consent and like the consultation process. It's actually getting our communities to actually buy like stock share and become owners of these industries, and it's like a new thing that's happening, and that's one thing that we need to be really aware of, because this fossil fuel industry is tanking and they want to bring our people down with it, and that's exactly how they're going to do it. And it's so new that our people are like, the people that you're talking about that do like to sell out our communities are like, oh my God, they want us to be, we're going to be our own bosses, we're going to do all, you know, and it's just like, no, you need to stop. So I just wanted to say that, because then on top of it, Ariel and I were talking about that there's actually climate litigation against fossil fuel companies. Now our communities are going to get sued because we're contributing to the climate crisis. So it's just this horrible, horrible thing that our communities are getting involved in because of some of the successes, but also some of the gaps that still remain in this type of work.
Yeah, and that's like it's really important too, because that's part of that whole false solutions piece, right? And you know, I think that they're often trying to get us to rush. You know, we're going to miss out, or we're going to lose our opportunity, or the world's going to end. And you know, what I always tell people is that Indigenous peoples are the experts on how to build power, to organize and build power juxtaposed against the end of your world. And we've been doing it in my territory for a couple hundred years now. You know, our world ended, you know, and we're building a new one, right? And so a lot of our you know, our adversaries and even allies in the white world and the Western world, you know, they're always in a rush. And it's so important that you don't rush, that we take our time to think about things. And I think that really applies to this Indigenous divestment stuff, and really just campaigning in a rights-based framework. You know, I've often heard that Indigenous rights are not human rights. You know, Indigenous rights are collective in their design. The UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, you can't take out the article related to free, prior, and informed consent, the right to say no, and just focus on that, just like you can't take out the right to develop, which is another article in the UNDRIP, which our friends who are pro-development, the ones who like to sell out, because we got greedy capitalist Indians in Indian country too, eh? Like the kind of the oil man, you know, the classic archetypes, you know, the Monty Burns. Like we have those people in Indian country too. They live everywhere. And so, you know, that's just something we got to deal with in-house, I think, and whatever, you know, like expose them to, you know, science is science, folks. You know, Indigenous traditional ecological knowledge is Indigenous traditional ecological knowledge, right? And so, you know, it doesn't matter who's pushing these bad ideas. We've got to expose them continually, replace those people who are in authority, decision-making power, with the right people who do the right thing. Yeah.
Beautiful. I just have to bring it back to this report again because you're bringing out all the calls to action at this point, and one of them is definitely support Indigenous governance and knowledge, you know, recognizing that expertise that comes from our people that are on the land and supporting what we call at ICA Indigenous science, because we are scientists as Indigenous people, and I will stand by that. So obviously supporting initiatives that validate and elevate Indigenous perspectives and practices are absolutely vital, especially when it comes to decision making. However, you did speak, Larissa, a little bit about, you know, that reciprocity approach from Indigenous peoples versus that tokenization approach. And it made me want to ask you, Clayton, how can we ensure that Indigenous voices are heard and not instead co-opted by non-Indigenous movements or people?
Yeah. You know, it's a tough one. It's really difficult, and when you start pulling threads on stuff like that, you can get into some pretty deep water. You know what I mean? But I think at the end of the day, you know, environmental justice tells us, and it's not just Native people, but all communities of color, that we speak for ourselves, and we are our own experts. You know? And I think that that's really important. Anytime I see an expert out there that's not Native, that's an expert on Native issues, and they're getting paid and sitting on panels to be an expert on Native issues, it's kind of suspect, eh? Like, it's a red flag for Native people. Don't get me wrong, there's some good experts out there that aren't Native, and they do a good job at being accountable about what they're good at, right? But by and large, a lot of people speak on our behalf, especially in the divestment reinvest sector. Okay, and I know there must be some reinvestment people in here because this is a very exciting and, you know, topic, Indigenous divestment strategies. But they're different than, like I said, just moving money out of Citibank. Okay, for us, it's about other leverage points, like the fact that in Canada, the banks that are financing fossil fuel destruction of our water, climate, and air, you know, these banks don't even service our people. There are no banks in Northern Canada. The banking services that Native people appreciate in Northern Canada are conducted by a genocidal company called the Northwest Company, the Northern, okay? And they're very famous for the astronomical prices they charge for food. Now the Northern they fly in gallons of milk on their airplanes into isolated fly-in Indigenous communities and sell it at a discounted rate, cheaper than our community-owned store. And they do that to undercut our people and our businesses because the way they make their money is through financial services. They cash checks on the res. They give people credit. They charge crazy interest. So there's no banking services that exist in Northern Indigenous communities within Canada. And so part of divestment and whatnot, one of the offshoots of that would be advocating for an actual freaking bank to even be in a Native community in Northern Canada. But these communities are the places where extractive industries and the government of Canada take all the resources, where the most toxic industries are. And the most of Canadians that live by the US-Canada border, they don't have to live with these industries, but Native people and environmental racism in our country, unfortunately, is disproportionately a very red and white dynamic.
Thank you. We're coming up to the question and answer period. We did start a little bit late, so I apologize for that. But I did want to give you the chance to speak to something that you had mentioned earlier a little bit more in depth, and that's more about the thoughts on redistribution of resources to ensure real Indigenous-led actions. And you know, you talked about Canada being kind of like this colonial superpower. And so how can we begin to address Canada or even North America as being that colonial superpower, and instead of funneling everything into there, how can we then ensure that resources are being distributed to other Indigenous nations and communities across the world?
I think there is a significant role for us to be in relationship with each other. It really matters to share strategies, to understand where resources come through without the attachment of determining what are the campaigns that we have to run on the terms of, you know, the global climate movement funders and that sort of stuff, particularly. Because if we're talking about and actually believe that land rights is the solution to the climate crisis, then actually that's not just like, you know, I sit in an organization, it's called Get Up, it's the largest campaigning organization in Australia. And I like make no apologies that I took on this role to get resources and hand them to First Nations communities, right? That's the work. But it also means that the work that we do in building relationships and understanding, like, you know, people get my phone number, mob across the country in Australia and talk about like, how did you do this thing? And we would connect people globally to Indigenous peoples. We would connect people in Australia to different fights, like how to lodge Section 18, Section 10s to basically have, look at the due process around cultural heritage destruction and those types of things. Those fights in our communities happen with people passing the hat around communities to try and do these things. Like, we're talking about elders who are the knowledge holders who, because of, you know, not in the same way around residential schools, but forced removal of country, you know, didn't go to school. And when, you know, my dad, he left school when he was 8 years old and had to go work for money and stuff like that. So there is a piece where our elders are the decision makers. But there's a bigger piece there around the work that we have to do. And I would say this, like, we need a global movement to kind of take on the work, the undermining work that happens out of North America, I think. Because that means our people in our communities at grassroots level actually need to have the resources. And we have, you know, so much tokenism that is happening in different spaces, or people that, you know, and this, I mean, this good ways, but like, there are people, and I understand people were removed from our communities, but if you have been removed from our communities, you've just discovered that you're an Indigenous person, you're a child. You have no ability to speak to kind of what our laws are, kind of our worldviews, where we're going, and understanding where we've been. And so that's really dangerous for us as well in terms of the way that we progress in this space around, especially in the climate movement, where it's just like there's kind of this fetishization of Indigenous peoples, and there has been for a really long time, right? Without understanding our rights and what we're actually for, because when it comes down to kind of the work that we're doing and understanding, even in Australia, like the climate movement came out of the conservation movement. They believe in a land without people. That is completely the antithesis of who we are. And so they don't believe in Indigenous rights, they believe in kind of like economic development, they believe in thinking about the fossil fuel transition, in these really kind of like siloed approaches. And I like to say, like, people talk about Indigenous solutions being complex. I think we live and breathe ecosystems, and we understand how to move across these challenges. So I think it's actually that thinking that is what is required for the climate crisis. And so even in the way that we make sure, you know, in the organisations and the work that we do, yes, it's important to fund our organisations, but it's also important to fund how spaces for us to collaborate, spaces for us to come together and talk about strategies, to actually talk about truth telling. And so not just stick within this kind of lens of like climate action, fossil fuels in, fossil fuels out, renewable energy, and we need to be talking about truth telling, what's actually happened in this land, who actually has rights here, you know, taking that moral high ground. We've, for a long time, for the last decade, if people don't know, we've done a significant amount of work. We have a national day called January 26th, Australia Day. We call it Invasion Day because it's a celebration of the invasion of our country. And we have worked as activists, and these are activists who have been on the front lines for 50 years. Incredible activists and younger generations coming through. Where now on January 26th, hundreds of thousands of people in a so-called Australia march on Invasion Day against kind of this narrative that is false. We had in 2018 people talking about how, you know, we need to change the date, and kind of this kind of milquetoast idea of like, we want to make up and, you know, this is how we move on reconciliation. No. You need to stay in this space of truth telling because we are not free and there is a lot of work to do, and there's a lot of things that we have to get across here in the work that we're doing. So it's about building allies, but building allies also on our terms. So to me, I mean, that's a roundabout explanation, but there is a critical part about how our communities get resourcing. And when you think strategically about, you know, a bunch of grassroots organisations that are fighting on front lines, or grassroots collectives or communities, they're never going to be funded by philanthropy. They're never going to kind of meet the demeanour of people that are seen to be speaking well enough to deal with in, you know, when we started SEED, the biggest thing that we had was, a very large environmental organisation said, actually mobilised around us and said, why would you help support a group and give people power that have no power? This is just going to be a mess for us, right? And this is what, when we were starting SEED, what we had to deal with. But the reality is like, we need to push resources into these communities. if there are organizations that actually can, like, I guess, de-risk, take that money from philanthropy and make sure it's going to a grassroots level, like, we don't need to be into, like, kind of jumping through the hoops around philanthropy and that sort of stuff, but we do need to make sure there's resourcing there, because we need to talk about a lot of the false solutions. Our communities have no money, they're economic deserts, and so those false solutions look like the way to freedom, and they're not. And so there's a lot of organising work that we have to do that, but means the front line needs to be funded, and we need to make sure, we need to be good custodians of the relationships and the work that we do, and basically spread that throughout our communities. And we even talk about, you know, we share donors across international Indigenous movements and that sort of stuff as well, but also resources and that sort of stuff. That's really important. I feel like I just went everywhere with that question, sorry.
That was great. So who wants to take on coordinating an international climate justice movement? Sounds like a call to action. No, I think that's really great. And I think that intersectional movement building is so vital and important when it comes to achieving climate justice, which brings me on to Melina. You said that after years of working on divestment strategies and campaigns to end the tar sands expansion, you felt driven to start creating real demonstrations of what Indigenous-led just transitions could be. With your work at Sacred Earth Solar, you've been actualizing these demonstrations for years. Can you elaborate on how an Indigenous-led just transition connects with the divestment movement?
Well, they're directly connected because divestment basically funnels into just transition, ideally. But I think prefacing what you said earlier, and we agree too, is just like if we continue to perpetuate the same systems of harm in the fossil fuel regime that we've all experienced and have burdened on our actual bodies into renewable energy sector, we're, like, Indigenous peoples are no better off. And I think having that critical analysis around renewables, energy transition, false solutions, carbon capture and storage, CCS, which they're totally trying to get our communities into, all of these types of things, what they want our communities to sign on to, we have to always have this critical eye around renewable energy even. Where does the critical minerals come from, right? And so as Indigenous peoples, we don't want to put our burden onto other people's, you know, and Indigenous peoples in other parts of the world. So having this critical analysis, and it's a very hard conversation to have, but we need to have it. And so with Sacred Earth, we've been utilizing small scale, little by little, for communities that are on the front lines that are utilizing solar technology to literally not, to be able to film their being arrested from blocking pipelines. You know, these are the types of projects that we're putting up. Or in my community where we built a 20.8 kilowatt system, a small scale top of pole system that powers our health center in the middle of the tar sands. And it was one of the first projects, solar projects that, you know, existed at the time, about a decade ago when we put it up. So trying to understand the technology, what the limitations are, what the practical applications are in implementation, because if we just talk about solutions but we don't actually know what the barriers are to implement them, how to implement them, what works, what doesn't work, then it's kind of, I just felt like frustrated after a while of just speaking about issues, you know, for 10, 15 years and not like starting to do the implementation around what does the dreaming and the visioning look like for our communities, where we've had this foreign imposition for so long saying this is what the solutions are, but yet they don't live the problems outside of our communities. So if we know what the problems are, we have to implement the solutions. And so that was a part of starting Sacred Earth, was to start doing small scale and then start building it in our community, start learning about if this works, if this doesn't work, and then start building it with other communities across the country. So we've built into so-called BC with Wet'suwet'en, Gidendam, other communities that are actively protesting against fossil fuel industries and pipelines, but also communities that are doing healing justice, that they're doing language revitalization. They live far out in the bush, and that they don't want to use diesel generators, where they're literally, you know, impacting their own health by breathing in these toxic fumes. And so implementing solar with Ottoman Collective, for example, where we've done, where they're doing like basically a language nest with Anishinaabe language. And so they're doing culture with Christy Belcourt and Isaac Murdoch. They're doing cultural revitalization, art, building and then rebuilding, and, you know, the revitalization of their language is like something that's so key in healing, because we all know within so-called Canada, majority of the languages are under major threat. You know, there's out of the hundreds that exist, there's only 3 that are set to quote unquote survive. And so if we're not building back into our communities, then that's a part of it. Another one that we solarized was, you know, in a community, in Six Nations community in Serena's back there from Sacred Earth helped implement it. And it's a two-spirit lodge, a healing lodge and a disability justice lodge where they're allowing people that have never been able to access lodge to go in with wheelchairs, to go in if they're blind. And so also for murdered and missing Indigenous family members and also for two-spirited siblings. And so having this type of healing that's accessible so they can have lights when they're, in the dark, have heat, have energy, make some tea, things like that instead of being really cold and like coming out of lodge. Everyone knows what it's like to come out of lodge when you're really hot and then you're freezing your butt off. So things like this, we're creating like community spaces. And so we're looking at more small scaled and maybe scaling up some, but it's really still having that critical analysis of like, even with the renewable energy, just like medicine can harm us, right? And also medicine can heal us. And so we need to look at every single climate solution of like, it's a potential thing to harm, but it's also a potential thing to heal. So how do we kind of bring that traditional teachings back into how we're kind of building climate solutions into the future? And so that's a part of the work of Sacred Earth. Hi, hi.
Beautiful. And you can read a little bit more. I know I'm plugging all of the resources, but if you are looking into learn a little bit more about Melina's project and her community, we have the Just Transition Guide that we released ICA, SES, Power to the People, Real World Media, and David Suzuki Foundation. I would highly recommend it. It's a really good read. With that,
Talk to Serena because she just solarized her Cayuga Longhouse too, so working with traditional governance. And anyways, I forgot that. I was like, she just finished putting that up like last month. Anyways, sorry, Serena.
I think it's just the coolest thing ever to be hearing all of these. It's just so action-based, all three of you. And I think that's just the way that I wanted to kind of close my comments before we move into a Q&A for folks. We still have a lot of time, which is great. I really appreciate all of the actions that you all have taken to ensure that for folks like myself that are younger and coming into this movement, we have the frameworks that we can then use and really start to recycle that work that you have already done and really led and created so much change already. So I'm really grateful. I did want to give the opportunity to folks to ask some questions. We have about like 20 minutes. Did anyone want to ask?
Thank you. My name is Reyes Devore. I'm from the Pueblo of Jemez, and we traveled here from New Mexico. I'm part of the program director with Pueblo Action Alliance, and I just want to say thank you for all of your knowledge that you share, but also expressing like the challenges and the losses and like everything, I think it's very important when we are able to like share those experiences. And I'm really happy that all of our youth fellows that came with us got to also listen and be here. But my question is, because there are the barriers and challenges to like just transitions and calling out false solutions, because we are fighting against like oil and gas in New Mexico, and now like a market that they're trying to put up as like carbon capture and hydrogen hubs. And so our group, we created a No False Solutions Coalition, and what we're doing, and my question to you all is what is your efforts, or where have your approaches been when it comes to like the labor sector of just transitions or moving away to newer and cleaner like renewable energy like resources? Because in New Mexico there is a lot of people who are pro oil and gas, like you guys spoke to, that like there are people who support industry, and a lot of them are like, well, this is what supports our people, and so I just like curious to kind of hear, like how do you guys work through that, and maybe what can you offer to us too as we like strategize and divest and invest also, because we're also, as an organization, we're moving to that and like planning and thinking broadly too, especially because New Mexico is like a resource colony for a lot of the nuclear weapons that are produced, so that's like another sector too.
Well, I think it's really important to say that, when we talk about the Native rights, like campaign framework and organizing framework, it's very different in the United States than it is in Canada. Like, for example, the status of food security, like harvesting rights. In Canada, they're locked in. They're constitutionally enshrined in Section 35 of the Canadian Constitution, the right to hunt, fish, and trap. These are inalienable rights that cannot be molested by corporations or provincial or territorial governments working within the Canadian Federation or by the federal government of Canada themselves. And so, you know, I think it's really important that we acknowledge the importance of not just bioregional planning of our economies, but also of our strategies, you know, and just taking into consideration our immediate like ecosystem that we're operating in. And what can we take from other ecosystems and relatives operating over there that'll help us, you know, where we're at. Because in Canada, you know, there are a good deal of vulnerable, low-hanging fruit, you know, major established institutions, corporations that are all tripping balls right now, especially the banks. They're all coming up with reconciliation strategies on how to address the Federal Commission on Truth and Reconciliation's 94 calls to action to right historical wrongs in the trust relationship between First Nations and the settler colonial state. There's similar dynamics here in the United States. I mentioned Edgar Villa, Decolonizing Wealth. You know, they've got some bucks that they've been investing in reconciliation kind of conversations with tribes. But that's still in its real juvenile infant stage, that organizing, right? And it needs to be invested in. And that discourse around truth, reconciliation, and the reparations that come with that, those actions here in the United States, you know, that's something that I think everybody living north of the medicine line is praying for, will be here to support. But there are very different strategies. Yeah.
I feel like the only other thing that I would add to that is just, obviously it's very different context. We have this, there are some more similarities between us and Canada, Commonwealth. But I do think there are the strategies that we have that are immediately in front of us, and there are then, you know, what we put our time into. And one of the things that I know people talk about healing, but I feel like there also is like how we bring our people to spaces. Like, I feel like we're in these spaces where, whether it's mining corporations and the governments are seeing Indigenous people as people who are deficient or people who are without. And I think sometimes we go into those spaces without kind of like having our kind of full kind of, you know, kind of ready for war, right? And I think there's a piece of like the work that we have done significantly over the fossil fuel fights back home is to take time to do ceremony, right? Like, I want to shout out like some young people, young men in the Northern Territory, Nick and Gadrian, and the work that they did basically to walk a songline that hadn't been walked in 40 years. The work to do that and to engage elders and talk about, you know, kind of walking across country from, you know, the Northern Territory into Queensland over weeks. And the amount of their communities that they have to engage to do that, it's not just about healing, but it's about kind of stepping into our full authority and growth as Indigenous peoples. And that is the authority that they, you know, building the relationship, kind of passing the torch on to a younger generation as well. They needed to do that to have that kind of authority. A lot of the work that kind of came from that space then was basically really having conversations about the vision and where the community was going. What does economic development look like on our terms? What does work look like in our communities, right? It's not a 9-to-5 thing, right? So how are we envisioning these systems different? And sometimes that feels like the nice thing that you can do on the side if we had time to do it. But actually, if we don't know where we're going, how are we going to get there? And so when you have these kind of corporations coming and talking about false solutions, we need to be armed with where we're going and that we already have an agenda, right? We actually don't need this kind of white saviorism, whether it's coming from mining corporations, whether it's coming from philanthropic spaces, to lead us, because we know where we're going and we have a plan. So either you're on board with our plan or we don't need you. And so I think that that's the way that we push back on those things, because otherwise it feels super complex.
Yeah. So I think a part of what I would, if you haven't read it yet, it would definitely be worth reading the Just Transition Guide that we just released. It's like a labor of love that I worked on for many, many years because I didn't have a guide to start building the solutions in my own community and was kind of having to do a lot of trial and error. So even my master's thesis is in there around that type of energy and climate literacy engagement with community and how to build from the ground, because I think, like, again, we don't want the outsiders to come in, so what do we want to envision from within? And so if you're that energy champion, if you're that climate champion, if you're that person, you know, what is the knowledge that you want to dispel that they're giving to our communities? So the misinformation we have to dispel from our communities, and then it's the kind of education, the energy literacy, the climate literacy that's so important, that starts with like kindergarten to grade 12 and then up. And so one of the things that we did when we started building the project in our home community is that I went in from kindergarten to grade 12 and talked about, you know, what is this project that the community just put up. We trained young people in our community that were like 18, 19, 20-year-old to try to get them interested in like becoming maybe an electrician, or just understanding what solar technology even is, and is it beneficial for the community, is it not going to be. And now the community, we started to see where people want to build a larger one, and that's not even coming from me, that's just coming from the leadership. And so it's just about planting those seeds. I know it's super overwhelming because you're like one person, right? And it's overwhelming. So it's like, just know that it's like, even if the seeds that you plant are going to flourish, you know, even if we don't always see that. And so I know, especially in the climate crisis right now, it's such a hard thing to not feel overwhelmed with like climate despair, and just even how our communities are set up in a rock and a hard place. And so it's just, you know, envisioning with yourself and the others that you work with of like, what is it that you want to propose to your community or the communities that you work with, and then kind of, and that's kind of, you know, just getting more community involvement and engagement. And that's, I felt like, how we started implementing solutions on the ground. So the Just Transition Guide would be a good start, but then also learning from other communities is something that I felt like I had a huge privilege of being able to do. We shot a TV show called Power to the People. We went from coast to coast, and I was able to visit 26 locations of Indigenous communities implementing a vast array of different type of technologies that worked for their communities, and it came from within the community. So it could have been geo-exchange, like certain type of technology that isn't invasive, isn't destructive, and so the communities chose it for themselves, and they implemented it, and they pushed back all of these types of barriers with the governments, the municipal governments, the provincial governments. So that's one thing that I would say, you know, like, I was just privileged, and I felt like by going to other communities, it just gave me the fire to continue to build as well, and learning from what worked for them and what didn't work for them. So that's one thing that I just hope that will help people that are kind of on that journey alongside with us. Hi. You can find it on our website.
Yeah, and it's just really important to develop, I guess, to answer the questions for your region. You know what I mean? Like, I think there's been a lot of work that's happened in different territories that we can look to and learn from as we like ask the right questions to our people where we live, you know. And I know for Indigenous divestment, you know, a lot of the bank engagement pre-pandemic, even pre-Standing Rock in Canada, was targeting the major Canadian banks, but there's been a lot of banks targeted here in the United States. And what that has informed is a bunch of other campaign areas. So, for example, in Canada, we've got a big problem with corporate sponsorship of our Indian cultural, education, and artistic institutions, and of just art institutions in general in society, museums, you name it, right? Schools, you know, see corporate sponsorship. So tracking the money thing and exposing it within the context of colonization, and especially within the vein of truth and reconciliation, sets up a lot of vulnerabilities, and it identifies those players out there in the economy and your ecosystem that are susceptible to that particular type of messaging. And in particular, it taps into that white liberal guilt shit, you know? It's toxic as hell, but it is a good motivator to a healthier conversation space. So, you know, and we have to acknowledge where we're at, you know? We know where we want to go, where we're at, and then we got to make the plan on how to get from here to there with our people, so.
Thank you. I wanted to, before I pass it to Ariel, who has a very important question, I did want to address one on the live stream. We also have a hard stop at 4. That's when the ASL interpreters have to head out. So the one question I wanted to ask, and please do not, short, we have only 15 minutes left. What might reciprocal relationships look like with the divestment movement and adjacent or intersecting movements, such as disabled, Black, trans, queer, Indigenous peoples movements? And that's from Beep Boop. Answer both.
I'm trying to save time. I think I just want to ask one, like, I think this question following that one is perfect. really straightforward. A lot of people that are caught up in trying to be like, we need to reduce GHG emissions, we have to stabilize and keep the global temperatures below 1.5, right? How does investing in Indigenous sovereignty help get us to climate stabilization?
Well,
You
Ariel.
can answer the other question too.
Yeah. For Ariel's question, it's pretty basic knowledge now how incredible Indigenous resistance is and how powerful the land back movement is, how powerful the message of what did the Dakota say? Minnewachuny, water is life. Like, and how powerful and beautiful the sister of Thunderbird Man, Thunderbird Woman has become this iconic image of the global climate movement. You know, like we're very powerful. And so, repeat your question again. Yeah, so Native people have demonstrated a huge percentage of the CO2 emissions that would have came from the burning of fossil fuels extracted. The amount of that our social movement efforts to keep fossil fuels in the ground across the board globally is like, I don't know what the percentage ratio is, but it's astronomical, especially considering that Indigenous peoples only represent 350 million Indigenous people out of the 8 billion people on the planet. We're contributing the least, we're paying the highest energy and food costs, and we're the ones who are keeping the majority of fossil fuel in the ground through our organizing efforts, okay? And this is just freaking brass tacks reality. And so, you know, I would also say that you know, Native people, we ain't gonna do to our land what, you know, Western society is. You know, we've literally changed the chemistry of the planet in 200 years. Spaceship Mother Earth, it's the only ride we got. So, you know, as far as solidarity, you know, I subscribe to the International Solidarity Framework. I think that it's really important that social movements act in solidarity without strings attached. You know, I show up for my friends in Black Lives Matters. I show up for my Palestinian relatives, and I don't expect them to come to my protests, but you know what? They do. Yeah. So, you know, and I think that international solidarity demonstrated its power. I think the last time we really came together was the battle in Seattle, WTO, when we stopped the consolidation of the global neoliberal free market trade agenda, and we forced nation states like Canada and the United States to go bilateral in their free trade negotiations. And we bought another 20 years for global social movements to get to now. And we need another big moment where international solidarists come together to do that work. So yeah, you know, our friends in the transgender, LGBTQ, I don't always forget what all the letters are in the statement, but you know, our two-spirited friends, you know, I think following in that kind of methodology, that framework, is just the way to expand your political base of resistance. And you know, we'll continue to do that as well. Because we're all the same community, whoever asked that question, you know? And you know, two-spirited people have a very sacred role in many of our Indigenous societies that is just now being exposed again, being brought back up again, so.
Yeah, I think just to tell a story around particularly Black Lives Matter, like 2020, we had a global reckoning with racism. And I think we are not yet there on the global reckoning with colonization, but we're starting to build, like, there is critical mass building around, like, Indigenous peoples understand it, but it feels like, especially now, like this year when we're talking about cost of living, the idea of like capitalism and the idea that young people are winning, like, it is just, even in the conversation that's happening in the States here, it seems insane that you would be having this conversation 5 years ago. And so, to talk about a story around for First Nations people in Australia, when we talk about sorry business, particularly Aboriginal people, when someone dies, we don't speak their name. And this movement around Black Lives Matter, say their name, recording police, it wasn't until the last 5 years of replicating those strategies that basically we had reckoning within our own countries around actually are people going missing? Are people being murdered by police? And like, why is that happening in kind of our communities and the brutality of police. So I think there's a lot to learn from different solidarity movements, but I do think there is like this thing happened around George Floyd where everyone was trying to work out where they sit on racism, and all of a sudden a bunch of people were like, oh, also there's Indigenous people that we need to deal with, because global solidarity movements didn't actually think about Indigenous peoples, and like, let's be honest. So there is this kind of looking left and right that's happening now, and I think there is a moment and an opportunity to go in with our solutions. And we are land-based people, we have solutions, and I think we have so much to offer this whole world, and I really do believe that around the transition that needs to happen, but also like how we rethink systems, because our systems actually work. Like, and I always believe this around Indigenous people, like we have communities. We have an epidemic of loneliness happening across this world, and we live in communities, right? We have something to offer, even if it's the idea that we are connected. People want that, right? And so our leadership right now, I think, is so incredibly important, and the sovereignty and the self-determination that we, there's this idea like, with the quote, they're like, power cedes nothing without a demand. There's this idea that we're gonna ask for self-determination. People like self-determination is an action that we just need to do. We just need to do it, we need to have the conversation, but we also need to be on platforms and talking about what Indigenous rights look like and where we're going, and the understanding that actually there's a pathway here for the entire world, right? Because, we believe as Aboriginal people that we belong to the land. We don't own the land, we belong to it. And so that is our role, and that is our place. And if we're gonna deal with this crisis, people need to understand that for everyone.
I think reciprocal relationships within movement spaces and how we are intersecting with other movements, disabled, Black, trans, and queer Indigenous peoples. I feel like we need to continue to push to have a culture of care and caretaking of one another, and a deep understanding of our differences, but also our commonalities, because I honestly don't want to be in the climate movement if we don't understand disability justice. I don't want to be in the climate movement if we don't understand the horrible treatment of our two-spirited siblings. It's like, I don't want to be in these movement spaces if we're not talking about the intersectionality of that and how we're bringing people, everyone along with us, I'm gonna go. Oh yeah, you do it. I won't do it justice. And then I guess the question for Ariel is, how is investing in Indigenous sovereignty, how does it contribute to climate stabilization? It's like Indigenous peoples are the ones who are safeguarding the last biodiverse regions in the fucking world. And if we protect 80% of what's left of, the very few small places on this planet. So if people don't invest in Indigenous sovereignty, we all fucking die, period.
Yeah, just on the solidarity tip, like we really do need your solidarity. Everybody tuning in right now online, and all of you that are here, like the RCMP, which is our FBI in Canada, these fuckers have killed 11 or 9? No, it's 9 now. It's 9 now. Since August, they murdered 9 of our people, the cops, the federal police, and so, our Native people keep getting killed by the police disproportionately in Canada, and, and a lot of our people, they face danger because they're defending the land, or they're in trauma because they've been forcibly removed from their land, and and that's a really traumatizing thing that just continues to happen day in, day out, you name it. And so, yeah, we really need your solidarity, because of this stuff that we're doing, we all got big smiles on our face, but it's a life and death thing. It's dangerous doing this stuff. And, so yeah, we all got to come together and watch each other's backs moving forward here, and we really need your help on this Indigenous divestment work. We need you to resource this. We need you to talk good about it. And, yeah, we need you to help us help society make the connections.
Thank you. Yeah. And with that, just because of the timing, we do have to wrap up, but I did want to mention, since you did mention disability justice, I wanted to thank COCO, which is a people of color-led organization that is bringing ASL to, ICA stuff. So I would highly recommend them in the future. It's very important. There is no climate justice without disability justice. And I wanted to thank the panelists today. Really amazing contributions as always. Take a look out for that report coming out next week. And remember, colonialism causes climate change. Indigenous rights are the solution.